This is a short story produced by StoryStream called Book 3, The Apocalypse Adventures of Two Brothers, Chris and Mike. Created by Christopher A. Lee and narrated by Brian Lawson. Thank you for listening to this story. If you could leave the name of the city you are listening from, it might randomly get picked for our Zombie Snapshot series. And if you enjoyed this short story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Chapter 1, The Road Out. The morning air bit with a sharp chill, slipping through the cracks of the old wooden cabin like the breath of a dying world. Chris stirred beneath a pile of tattered blankets, his body sore from another restless night on the warped hardwood floor. He didn't open his eyes right away. Instead, he lay still, listening. Nothing. No wind. No birdsong. No hum of insects. Just the quiet weight of absence. He finally sat up, dragging in a breath that felt heavier than it should have. With slow, practiced movement, he padded barefoot across the cold floorboards to the boarded front window. Thin rays of dawn filtered through the gaps between the planks, painting slashes of dusty gold on the opposite wall. He leaned in, eyeing the world through one of the narrow peepholes they'd drilled months ago. Outside, the forest stood silent and unmoving. Pines loomed like sentinels, skeletal and indifferent. The mist clung low to the ground in ragged patches, hiding the contours of the dirt path that had once been a driveway. No signs of life. No signs of death either. Chris scratched the back of his neck and turned. "Wake up, shithead," he called across the dim interior. His voice echoed slightly in the enclosed space. "Time to go out and scavenge for supplies and hope we don't meet our maker today." Mike groaned from under his blanket cocoon in the corner of the room. His face peeked out just enough to reveal squinting, bloodshot eyes. "Bro," he muttered, voice gravelly. "I got something for you." Chris raised an eyebrow, already smirking. "Yeah? What's that, dude?" Mike slowly raised one hand from beneath the covers and extended his middle finger. "This sucker," he said, letting it hover in the air for emphasis. Then he dropped it and rolled back over. "I'm going back to sleep for a few." Chris let out a short, dry laugh. "Jackass," he said under his breath, amused in a way only brothers could be. It felt good, the banter. Familiar, human. A thread of the old world stubbornly holding on. Without another word, Chris grabbed his Mossberg from the wall hook and slung it across his back. He pulled on a flannel shirt, its sleeves frayed and the collar permanently stained with sweat and blood. He slid his hunting knife into the sheath, strapped to his thigh, and stepped into his boots. Worn leather molded to the shape of his feet. He didn't need to say where he was going. Mike would know. Chris opened the front door slowly, letting it creak just enough to warn anything on the other side. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards groaning beneath his weight. The air was cool and damp, rich with the scent of pine and decay. He took a long breath, then another.
Still nothing.
But that was the danger, not the sound, the silence. Chris descended the steps and began a slow perimeter check, boots crunching softly on the damp undergrowth. His eyes scanned every shadow, every patch of disturbed earth, every broken twig. He moved like a ghost, his senses honed sharp by 3 months of survival in a world gone to rot. It was month 6. And still, every morning felt like the first day of the end. He reached the creek on the southern edge of the property, the water sluggish but clean. He knelt beside it, scooped some into his canteen, then stood. As he rose, something caught his eye, a rusted glint beneath a moss-covered log. Cautiously, he approached and nudged it with his boot. A tangle of old cans, some intact, some long rusted through. Jackpot. He crouched, careful not to make too much noise, and sorted through them. A few still had weight. Peaches, corn, a single tin of sardines. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Then movement. A branch snapped across the creek. Chris dropped low behind the log, shotgun raised, every nerve firing. The underbrush swayed slightly, something lumbering through it. Slow, heavy, shambling. One zombie, just one. It stumbled into view. A middle-aged man, or what was left of him. Jaw slack, neck twisted unnaturally, half his chest peeled open like a rotten fruit. Chris stayed low, tracking the movement, waiting to see if there were more. None followed. In a fluid motion, Chris slipped the Mossberg from his shoulder and approached. Quiet, efficient. At 5 feet, the zombie turned, sensing movement, lips peeling back from blackened gums. Chris didn't hesitate. He surged forward, grabbing the creature's shirt to pull it off balance, spun it, and jammed his knife upward beneath its jaw. The blade pierced the skull with a wet crunch. The zombie collapsed, twitching once. Chris wiped the blade clean on the grass and glanced back toward the cabin. Still quiet, still safe.
For now.
He returned to the porch, placed the cans gently on the step, and exhaled slowly. Mike was standing in the doorway now, arms crossed, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You find God out there or just breakfast?" Mike asked. Chris grinned. "Sardines and peaches, it's a holy day." Mike chuckled and stepped outside. He looked around, scanned the tree line, then nodded. "Let's take the truck. Hit the back road. If anything's still got fuel, it'll be the farm rig southbound." Chris tilted his head, intrigued. "You thinking Madras? Redmond?" "Maybe further," Mike said. "There's that resort out near Ta. Might still have backup generators. Water tanks, gear left behind." Chris nodded slowly. "Could be a gold mine. Could be crawling with rotters. Ain't everything now," Mike muttered. They packed quickly, just the essentials. Weapons, med kit, siphon hose, empty fuel containers. Chris double-checked their sidearms while Mike did a walk-around on the truck. The old Dodge Power Wagon rumbled to life with a deep growl that shattered the stillness. Birds scattered from the trees. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a howl echoed faintly. Chris didn't flinch. They rolled out slow, tires crunching the gravel road that led through the forest. Abandoned cabins appeared like ghosts in the woods, quiet, untouched, and likely stripped bare. But they stopped anyway. Each house was a gamble. Chris moved in first, silent, precise, clearing each room. Mike followed, sweeping for anything useful. They found a couple cans of dog food, a pair of propane bottles, and half a box of .22 rounds. Better than nothing. Downed vehicles littered the back road. Most were picked clean, but Mike managed to siphon nearly 4 gallons of gas from an old Bronco wedged in a ditch. Midday, they stopped outside a collapsed barn. Chris leaned against the truck, stretching his shoulders. "You remember Chronicles as a kid?" he asked. Mike smiled faintly. "That place had the best pool, and that little hot spring trail. We used to race." "Yeah," Chris said. "Now it's probably a ruin." "So are we," Mike said with a grin, and climbed back in the truck. They reached the outskirts of the reservation by late afternoon. The land here stretched wide, dry, and golden. Broken fences led to open meadows and wind-worn signs. The resort loomed in the distance, windows smashed, signs faded, but still standing. They parked behind a maintenance shed and went in on foot. The place was silent, too silent. Chris took point. Hallways dark, empty rooms filled with overturned furniture and dust. But there was power faint. The backup system was still feeding the emergency lights. They found the generator in the basement. Still running, still humming. A miracle. And beside it, 2 corpses, long dead. Bullet wounds, no reanimation. Someone had been here. They raided what they could: dry goods in the kitchen, a med kit in the office, a radio they weren't sure would ever pick up a signal. Then came the groan. Outside, dozens of them, drawn by the truck, drawn by movement. Chris and Mike bolted for the back hall, weaving through service corridors. "Out the spa door," Mike barked. They kicked it open. Chris took out the first sprinter, a teenage boy, mouth frothing, legs still fast. A single slug to the chest slowed it. A knife to the neck ended it. They piled into the truck. Mike peeled away, tires spitting dirt. Dozens of shamblers spilled onto the road behind them, but none were fast enough to follow. They didn't speak for miles. Back at the cabin, they unloaded silently. Bruised, spent, but alive. "Good call," Chris finally said. Mike nodded. "Next time we find a place that smells less like chlorine and death." Chris laughed, a real tired laugh, and they stepped inside as the forest swallowed the light. Chapter 2, The Scarcity Below. The morning after Chronicles, the cabin was quiet again, too quiet. A creeping fog had settled across the forest floor, threading itself between the tall pines like ghost fingers. Chris sat at the edge of the porch, legs hanging over, cleaning the blood off his knife with a scrap of canvas. The steel glinted faintly in the overcast light. He worked in silence, face unreadable. Inside, Mike paced. Their haul had been decent, but nowhere near enough. "We're burning through supplies too fast," Mike said, checking their tally scratched into the wall by the pantry. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if we stretch it. Chris didn't look up. "We'll stretch it. Ration tighter. Make it work." "It's not just food," Mike continued. "We're almost out of antibiotics. Batteries are down to a handful. No flares. 2 cans of propane left. We're bleeding resources." Chris sighed and slid the knife back into its sheath. "Then we bleed slower." But they both knew slow bleeding still led to the same end. By midday, they were in the truck again. The plan was to search deeper beyond the towns that had already been picked clean. Chris drove this time, eyes sharp behind the wheel, scanning every signpost and half-collapsed billboard like they might point the way to salvation. They passed through Metolius, then Culver ghost towns draped in vines and silence. Occasionally they spotted movement, a lone zombie caught in a wire fence, or a pair wandering aimlessly in the middle of the road. No hordes, not yet. Just remnants, leftovers. But even remnants were dangerous when your guard slipped. They stopped outside a church on the outskirts of Madras. The steeple leaned precariously. One of the stained glass windows had been shattered, but the heavy front doors were intact. They exchanged a look. Chris nodded. Mike grabbed the shotgun. Inside, the pews were overturned, Bibles scattered like fallen leaves. Sunlight spilled through the shattered glass in colorful streaks that did nothing to hide the decay. There were bones in the front row, child-sized, curled against the pulpit. The smell was faint, old. Chris crouched and lifted a dusty knapsack from behind the altar. Inside, 3 water bottles, a can of beef stew, 2 flare guns, and "No way," Chris muttered, pulling out a fresh roll of medical gauze. "Score." Mike was rummaging through a nearby storage closet. He emerged with a grimace and a yellow container of kerosene. Not food, but it'll run the heater for a few days. Outside, the wind was picking up, and with it came a sound faint, hollow, like a breath caught in a rusted pipe. Chris froze. That's not wind. They bolted. The moment they stepped outside, they saw them dozens, maybe more, emerging from behind the slope across the street. No sprinters, all shamblers, but too many, too close. "Truck, now!" Mike barked. Chris didn't argue. They sprinted, slamming the doors shut just as the first hands reached the bumper. The engine growled to life. Mike leaned out the window, taking 2 quick shots to clear a path. The Dodge plowed forward, wheels crushing bone and gravel. Back on the open road, they didn't slow down for miles. When they finally pulled off near a dry riverbed to catch their breath, Chris slumped back in his seat. That church was too clean, too untouched. Mike wiped sweat from his brow. It was a trap, or it became one. Place like that, people went there hoping for salvation. They died praying. Chris didn't respond right away. He just stared out the windshield, watching a hawk circle overhead. Then he said quietly, "You ever think about what we're going to do when the fuel finally runs out? When there's nowhere left to scavenge?" Mike was silent for a long moment. "Yeah," he said at last. "I think about it every night." They didn't talk much the rest of the way. Later that afternoon, they reached the outskirts of Terrebonne, a small town tucked against the high desert cliffs of Oregon. The familiar site of the gas station near Lower Bridge Way was a beacon even if it was a faint one. The guys parked the truck just outside what used to be a Chevron and went in on foot. The mini-mart had been hit hard, but they found a few scattered treasures, some canned soup, 2 bottles of iodine, and a dusty old pack of AA batteries. Chris rifled through the checkout counter and pulled out a scratch Bic lighter with a tiny flame that still worked. Down the road, they hit a small general store Terrebonne thrift and farm supply. Rusted hardware, animal feed, busted shelves. But behind the counter was a sealed first aid box. Mike popped it open with his knife and grinned. Jackpot, gauze, scissors, burn cream, the works. Chris was looking at a bulletin board where old photos of missing pets, school plays, and church events still clung in faded ink. Whole damn world just stopped. They moved into the residential side of town. Abandoned houses lined the cul-de-sacs, most with doors kicked in or garages torn open. In one small blue home with white trim, they found something unexpected. Movement. Chris froze at the creak of a floorboard upstairs. Mike raised his gun. "Don't shoot," a voice called, male, calm but firm. They waited. Moments later, 4 figures emerged slowly from the top of the staircase. A tall man with shaggy blonde hair and a beard nodded. "Name's Chad. We're not looking for trouble." Beside him, a woman with a hunting rifle. Mary kept her eyes locked on the brothers. 2 younger guys followed behind, one with short-cropped dark hair and a scar across his jaw, Rex, and the other, lanky with a sling over one arm, Eli. Mike and Chris lowered their weapons but didn't holster them. "We're just passing through," Chris said. "Looking for supplies." Chad shrugged. "Same. This is the last house on our sweep. You boys find anything better?" Mike chuckled. "Some soup and a dusty-ass lighter. You?" Mary relaxed a little. "Old root cellar 3 blocks east, half a case of jerky. I'd say we won the day." Despite the tension, the 6 of them shared stories for a while, exchanged what little intel they had. Turned out Chad's group had come down from the Dalles. They were headed toward Ben, hoping for rumors of a safe zone. No one believed it existed, but hope was stubborn. That night, they made camp in the old elementary school on Smith Rock Way. The gym was barricaded with filing cabinets and desk furniture. In the dim glow of battery lanterns, the two groups shared a meal and made uneasy laughter. It felt almost normal, until the banging started. From the cafeteria wing, Chris stood first. "Too fast, that's not a shambler." Eli looked pale. "Kids, we saw some yesterday. They were fast." Mike and Rex nodded to each other and moved into formation, flashlights sweeping the narrow hallway. As they approached the cafeteria, shadows flickered across the frosted windows. Then a crash. The door burst open. A flood of small, jerky figures poured out, children, fast, screeching, their eyes clouded and feral, their bodies torn, but agile, sprinters. Dozens of them. Chris didn't hesitate. He spun and slammed the door shut, jamming a steel broom through the handles. "Everyone move! We're out! Now!" Screams echoed through the halls as the group bolted. Mary covered the rear, dropping two with precision rifle shots. Chad kicked open a side door, and they poured into the night, the horde screeching behind them. Back at the trucks, engines roared. The infected kids slapped and scratched at the doors, leaving streaks of blood and filth. When they finally broke away, silence returned only after miles. Chris stared ahead, jaw clenched. "Those were kids, man." Mike said nothing. Rex lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "That's why we keep moving." By the time they returned to the edge of the forest, the sun had begun to set. Chad's group set up a small fire just outside the tree line, while Chris and Mike unpacked their own haul. They sat in a circle, tired, scraped, and quiet. And for just one night, they weren't alone. Chapter 3, New Blood. The morning broke with a sky full of low gray clouds. The air was still and damp, the scent of pine mingling with the faint, acrid tinge of last night's smoke. Chris leaned against the hood of the truck, arms folded, staring at the dying embers of the small campfire. Behind him, the forest stretched like a wall of silence, endless and unknowable. "You think they'll follow us back?" Mike asked, stepping beside him, brushing crumbs from his beard. Chris shook his head. "Nah, Chad's crew seems decent. They're heading to Bend. Not idiots, not desperate." Mike took a long drink from his canteen, then offered it to Chris, who declined. From the fire, Rex stirred, blinking sleep from his eyes. Mary was already awake, squatting near a small map drawn crudely on butcher paper. Eli sat beside her, cradling his bad arm. It was odd how fast companionship could form in the apocalypse. A shared meal, a near-death skirmish. Suddenly, you weren't strangers anymore. By mid-morning, they were splitting up. Hugs were too soft for this world, so they shook hands, firm, brief. Promises were made to meet again, but none were expected to be kept. Chris and Mike loaded the truck with new supplies and turned northward. Their destination was vague, just another cluster of small towns somewhere near Warm Springs. Maybe they'd hit Madras again, maybe not. They avoided the same route twice unless they were sure it was still cold. Too risky. Mike fiddled with the truck's ancient radio, catching nothing but static. Chris focused on the road, eyes trained for movement in the distance. "You ever think we should have joined them?" Mike asked. Chris didn't answer immediately. Then, "No, that's not us." "Yeah," Mike muttered. "That's what I thought." An hour later, they rolled into the remnants of a rural mechanic shop just past a dusty bend on Highway 26. The sign out front read, "Jerry's Auto and Tire." The windows were broken and the interior ransacked, but it was quiet. They parked behind the building, weapons out. Chris led, gliding between shadows with the kind of silent grace only years of training could produce. Mike followed, gun held low but ready. Inside, a few tools remained, scattered across the concrete like the aftermath of a storm. Empty drawers, broken glass. But in the far back, beneath a tarp, they found a rusted but intact fuel pump and one full canister. "That's rare," Mike said. "Too rare." Chris knelt beside the canister. The lid was sealed, no tampering. "We take it and go," he said. The moment they stepped outside, gravel crunched beneath tires. A beat-up truck rolled up from the tree line, its engine rumbling low. A tall man with a black duster and mirrored sunglasses stepped out and looked directly at Chris. "That's mine, boy. Put it down," he drawled, voice flat and confident. Chris tilted his head slightly. "I don't see any boys around here. You stopped at the wrong spot. I suggest you move on while you can." 3 men emerged from the truck bed roof, armed, mean-eyed. They fanned out around Chris with slow, practiced movements. Should have walked away, one of them muttered. But Chris didn't walk. He moved. In a flash, he twisted the closest man's arm behind his back and drove his face through the shattered window of a wrecked sedan, shards exploding around the thug's skull. The second swung a pipe. Chris ducked, spun, and snapped his legs sideways with a roundhouse kick. Bones cracked. The third was smaller, a midget with cruel eyes and a jagged blade. Chris grabbed him mid-lunge, lifted him overhead with effortless force, and hurled him like a rag doll into a nearby steel post. The crunch was wet. His spine bent in a direction no body should. Mike raised his rifle. "You want quiet or loud?" Chris stepped over the groaning bodies. "Quiet." The leader was gone. Tires screeched down the highway as he fled, leaving his men broken and bleeding in the dust. That evening, they camped in the hills overlooking a long-abandoned rail line. The wind whispered through the high grass, brushing against the walls of their small nylon tent. Chris sat writing in a weathered leather journal, his back to the fire. Mike stripped his rifle, cleaning each part with mechanical care. "You know," Chris said, not looking up, "it felt good, fighting beside other people again." Mike nodded. "Until the cafeteria. That changed the tone." "Yeah," Chris whispered. "When that did." They were quiet for a long time. Eventually, Mike said, "Still, I like them." Chris nodded once, turning the page in his journal. "I did too." They rose early the next day, before the sun breached the horizon. The sky glowed a dim, dusky red as they packed up camp. Mike loaded the supplies into the truck, while Chris scouted the nearby ridgeline. "Track," he said when he returned. "Truck. 2 days old at most. Heading northeast. Our friend with the sunglasses?" Chris shrugged. "Could be. Either way, someone else is in the area." They drove in silence, following the old service road that twisted through canyon walls and brush-choked hills. After 20 minutes, the forest opened to reveal a shallow gorge with a collapsed bridge. On the far side, smoke curled lazily from a chimney buried deep in the woods. Chris killed the engine. "That's not abandoned." Mike raised his scope, scanning. "Yeah, and someone's on the roof, armed, watching." They backed away without a word. Back in the truck, Mike said, "You think that guy's building a little empire out here?" Chris grunted. "Let him. We'll circle wide. There's more to scavenge south." Mike nodded slowly, thoughtful. "You know it won't be the last time we see him." Chris just started the truck. "I know." They found shelter for the night in an abandoned ranger lookout tower off a service road tucked deep into the trees. From its height, they could see the skeletal outlines of towns they once knew. Warm spring shimmered far off, like a memory lost in fog. Inside, the air was stale, but secure. A weathered cot, old ranger logs, and a cabinet of ancient MREs greeted them like relics from a better world. Chris sat at the edge of the platform, scanning the horizon through binoculars while Mike warmed soup over a tiny alcohol stove. "Remember our first week at the cabin?" Mike asked suddenly. Chris lowered the binoculars. "I remember the silence. Thought it would drive me crazy." "Yeah, but you didn't crack. Didn't have time to. You showed up with that beat-up Mossberg and a whole truck bed of deer jerky." Mike grinned. "Damn right I did." They ate in silence, the warmth of the meal a small defiance against the creeping cold. That night, they took shifts watching the tree line. The forest creaked. Somewhere in the distance, a single dragging moan broke the stillness. Just one. But it was enough. Chris lay back on the cot, eyes wide open, whispering the words he wrote earlier. "We're not just surviving, we're remembering." Chapter 4, Shifting Ground. The ranger tower creaked in the wind. Chris watched the treetops sway gently below, feeling the altitude in his bones. Morning sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin gold shafts, casting long shadows on the mossy ground. He'd barely slept. Too many thoughts. Too many things left unsaid. Mike climbed the last step of the wooden ladder, a tin mug of coffee in each hand. "Didn't hear anything all night," he said, setting one mug beside Chris. Chris took a sip, bitter but warm. He nodded thanks. "That guy we let walk away, he's a problem." Mike leaned on the railing, watching a squirrel dart between branches far below. "Yeah, but it wasn't the time to finish it." Chris didn't argue. Instead, he unfolded the paper map they'd marked with grease pencil X6 places hit, places untouched, places best avoided. "We should hit the outskirts of Prineville, small ranch towns, then maybe the Crooked River Bridge." Mike studied the terrain. "Gas will be the limiter. We're down to a quarter tank. We might have to go through Redmond again." Chris frowned. I don't want to go back there. Neither do I. But if we skirt west and hit the supply shed near Ochoco Creek, we might get lucky. They rolled out before the fog lifted, tires crunching frost-hardened gravel. The forest gave way to arid ridge lines and winding backroads. Every so often, they'd spot a burned-out car, a collapsed farmhouse, or a lone shambler wandering the shoulder. Chris kept his machete close. Mike kept his rifle closer. An hour outside the ranger station, they stopped at a collapsed barn. Inside, they found old canning jars filled with dehydrated fruit, a hunting bow strung tight, and a box of rusted .30-06 rounds. Chris inspected the bow's limbs, while Mike checked for any movement outside. Midway through the morning, Mike spotted a gas station hidden behind a thick cluster of juniper and pine. The sign had long since fallen, and the windows were blackened with soot, but the pumps were intact. They approached slow. Chris got out first, moving with the silent grace of a predator. Mike covered from the truck, scope glinting in the rising sun. Chris tapped on the side of the pump. Empty. The second pump, empty. Then a sound metal on metal, inside the building. He motioned to Mike and circled toward the back door. Inside, it stank of mildew and blood. Shelves were overturned. A display fridge had collapsed, pinning a rotting body beneath it. Then a voice ragged, afraid. "Don't shoot!" Chris froze. A woman crouched behind the counter, pale, sunken cheeks, a revolver trembling in her grip. "We're not here to hurt you," Chris said calmly, hands slightly raised. Mike entered behind him, rifle still low but ready. She kept the gun trained on them. "You're not with the others? The ones with the dog skull tattoos?" Chris exchanged a look with Mike. "No, we're just scavenging." She exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "They came through 2 days ago, took everything, left my brother dead. I've been hiding since." Her name was Tasha, 25, former vet tech. She hadn't seen a safe zone in over 6 months. Chris offered her food. Mike offered her a ride. She said yes to both. They drove on, the extra set of eyes and hands a welcome, if temporary, comfort. Tasha rode in the back seat, clutching her pack like it might disappear. Her eyes flicked to every shadow along the roadside. In the distance, the highway split one path toward Crooked River, another deeper into the canyon. Chris took the canyon road. They found a crumpled station wagon half buried in the dirt near the trailhead. Inside were 3 bodies, buckled in. No signs of struggle. No blood. "Carbon monoxide?" Tasha asked. "Looks like it," Chris said. "They just gave up." They checked the vehicle for gas tank was empty. They said a few prayers for the family, then moved on. They scavenged an abandoned campground further down the canyon. Most of the tents were shredded or moldy. Inside one, they found a duffel bag of canned chili, water filters, and a bundle of fire starter sticks. A Coleman stove lay beneath the table, intact. "We're keeping that," Mike said, strapping it down in the truck. Throughout the day, they scavenged several cars and trucks abandoned along the roadside, sun-bleached relics of a lost world. One sedan still held a zombie inside, strapped in tight with a seatbelt. Its jaw moved in a ceaseless, snapping motion, maggots writhing in the melted flesh of its face, skin blistered and blackened by the sun. Chris opened the door and put it down with a swift jab of his machete. Another SUV had a young couple turned, jaws locked in eternal screams, their fingers clawing at the dashboard. Mike quietly dispatched them both with 2 rounds, clean and fast. Then came the old Chevy truck. It looked like it had been untouched, but the moment Mike opened the driver's door, 2 figures lunged from the back seat, kids, maybe 8 or 9. Their shriveled gray arms reached with sickening speed. Mike didn't flinch. He put the first one down with a knife to the temple, twisted, then slammed the second one into the pavement, ending it quick. Chris stood nearby, eyes tight with emotion, but said nothing. Later that afternoon, while searching vehicles for fuel and supplies along a crumbling turnout, they came across a rusted Ford pickup buried in sagebrush and dust. The bed was filled with fishing gear nets, tackle boxes, fly rods, and even a few sealed tins of bait. It looked untouched. Chris opened the side door and grinned. "We're eating tonight." They took what they could fit: nets, a few poles, some rooster tails and fly reels, and tossed it in the truck. As dusk fell, they followed a dirt road down toward the Crooked River Canyon. They reached an overlook where the canyon spilled out below them in sweeping, jagged cliffs. The river glistened, serpentine and silver, cutting through the red rock like a wound. That night, camped near the river under a stretch of stars, they cast lines from the rocky bank and threw the net wide across a still pool. Mike caught nothing. Chris snagged a trout on a rooster tail, but it was the net that saved dinner. It dragged in 5 fish, flopping and alive. They cooked over a small fire and sat in silence, chewing warm, fresh fish beneath a sky blanketed in stars. For a moment, just one, it felt like the world hadn't ended. After a while, Tasha broke the silence. I used to work at an animal hospital in Bend. Vet tech, cleaned wounds, assisted surgeries, calmed, scared pets. Never thought those skills would help me fight for my life. Chris poked at the fire. You lose anyone? She nodded slowly. My brother, the one I told you about. But before that, my mom. She had asthma. And the first week, the pharmacies were wiped out. I buried her in our backyard, just me. No one came to help. Mike handed her a water canteen. And the dog skull guys? Tasha's jaw clenched. They stopped us, claimed they were forming a new order, took our food, our gear, and tried to take me too. My brother fought back. He didn't make it. I ran, hid, found that gas station, and figured it was as good a tomb as any. Chris looked out across the dark canyon, the stars reflected in the slow water below. We've all buried people, but you didn't stay buried. That counts for something. Mike leaned back against a rock. This world takes everything. It's what you hold on to that matters. Tasha gave a small nod. Her eyes shimmered in the firelight. Then I'm holding on to this moment, right here, with you two. Chris cracked a half smile. Just don't hold on too tight. We're not exactly stable company. She chuckled, a sound soft and real. That's all right. I've never been good at normal anyway. Tasha sat with her knees pulled to her chest. You two are different. Mike glanced up. Different how? You don't hesitate. You don't talk about what was. You just keep going. Chris stared into the dark. Because if we stop, we start remembering. And that's the fastest way to die out here.
There was a long pause.
Then Tasha said, I want to keep moving too, with you. Both brothers looked at each other, gave each other a slight smile. Neither brother said no. And just like that, their world shifted again. Chapter 5, River Run. The morning air was sharp with chill, curling mist rising from the riverbank as the trio packed up camp. The fire pit still smoldered faintly, sending up thin fingers of smoke that vanished into the awakening dawn. Chris slung his pack over his shoulder and scanned the horizon. We move south today, he said. Try for Sisters or maybe as far as Blue River if gas holds. Mike checked their tank the night before. They had just over half. Enough if they were careful, but not enough for a full detour. Tasha was quiet, helping fold the tarp, her expression tight with thought. Something about last night had settled in her bones. She'd shared too much, maybe, but she hadn't walked away. That mattered. They drove slowly through winding forest roads, the pines closing in on either side, until the world felt wrapped in green silence. The only sounds were tires crunching over gravel and the occasional distant crow call. Chris rode shotgun, scanning each passing car and fallen log. Mike drove, sunglasses on, focus forward. Tasha sat in back, a pistol in her lap. They passed an abandoned ranger checkpoint. Chris tapped the window. Pull over, might be supplies. The cabin was partially collapsed, roof caved in and floor warped with mildew, but the storage shed behind it was locked tight. Mike shot the padlock. As the door creaked open, a foul stench poured out. Inside, hunched in the corner, was the rotting corpse of a park ranger. Except he wasn't dead. Not fully. His uniform hung in tatters, badge glinting weakly in the dim light. His eyes were cloudy, his lips shredded, teeth clacking as he lunged toward them. Chris moved first, slamming the machete down into the ranger's skull. The body dropped without a sound. Chris wiped his blade clean and looked around. How the hell did he end up locked in here? Chris glanced at his brother Mike. Maybe the sunglasses guy did this. They found boxes of water purification tablets, some still sealed protein bars, and 2 solar-charged radios, one cracked, one pristine. Chris grinned. That's a win. They pressed on. Near Santiam Pass, the road choked with cars. A pileup, burned-out shells, shattered glass, dried blood smeared across windshields. Chris and Mike moved in first. Tasha covered their 6. Car to car, they searched. Some vehicles still had luggage, some had bodies. One had both. Inside a tan SUV, a woman had clawed her own throat out. In the back seat, her daughter Tern was still writhing against the seatbelt, little fingers snapping, teeth clicking in time with some dark instinct. Mike opened the rear door and ended it quickly. No hesitation. They found 2 full gas cans in a camper van and a cooler of jerky so old it had fossilized. Chris took the gas, left the meat. They stopped to scavenge a few more vehicles. One pickup truck had a pile of fishing supplies in the bed nets, tackle boxes, even fly rods and spinner baits. They took what fit in their truck. Later that night, when they camped near the Crooked River, they threw the net into the water and fished in shifts. Tasha caught 2 using a fly. Mike got 1 with a rooster tail. The net caught 5 more. That night, by the crackle of a modest fire, they grilled fish on scavenge foil and remembered old camping trips with their dad. "You ever think about that time at Sparks Lake?" Mike asked, nudging Chris. "When you fell in trying to show off for Sarah?" "Yeah, I think about it all the time." Laughter, real and brief. Tasha stared into the flames. "I used to fish with my grandfather, up near Pendleton. Before all this." Her voice trailed off. The moment sat heavy for a beat. They moved on. As they passed a school bus that lay half-tilted in a ditch, the silence was broken by a soft moan. Chris raised a hand. They froze. From behind the bus, a figure stumbled out, human. Thin, arms up. "Don't shoot, I'm alone." He was maybe 30, skin like paper, wearing a Forest Service jacket 2 sizes too big. Name tag read, Ellis. Chris approached first. Name? Ellis. Was a dispatcher. Been living off Squirrel and Creek water. Haven't seen anyone in, God, weeks. Tasha stepped closer. "You bitten? Scratched?" He lifted his shirt. Bruises, ribs showing, but no wounds. They fed him, a bar, some water. Ellis told them of a route into Prinville, said he'd passed through a few weeks back, and found signs of survivors gathering near the reservoir. Claimed the place had solar panels, a shortwave radio, and possibly another survivor. An old man named Devin. Mike glanced to Chris. A radio was worth the detour. They let Ellis ride with them in the back. He thanked them a dozen times before nodding off from sheer exhaustion. As they drove through Redmond on their way toward Prinville, the city showed signs of rapid collapse. Strip malls had been gutted, windows smashed, parking lots littered with decaying cars and scattered bones. They stopped near an old convenience store. Redmond Quick Mart, still partially standing. Inside, they found Monster energy drinks, some expired canned goods, and a half case of warm beer. Chris tossed one to Mike without a word. Farther down the road, they checked an outdoor gear shop, High Desert Sports. Broken glass crunched beneath their boots. They found a stash of fishing tackle, utility knives, and a pair of boots in Mike's size. Tasha scored a compact hunting bow and a handful of arrows. By the time they left Redmond's outskirts, their truck bed was heavier, but spirits slightly lifted. The land began to open up, rolling grasslands, giving way to pine forests again. Here and there, they stopped to check abandoned vehicles along the shoulder. In one old sedan, they found a duffel of canned soup and a pair of binoculars. Another, a minivan with shattered windows, still held 2 zombies strapped in their seatbelts, jaws snapping feebly. The heat had warped their flesh, maggots bubbling under parchment-thin skin. Chris ended them without a word. Later, in a pickup truck slumped in a ditch, Mike opened the door and was met with a blur of motion. 2 child-sized zombies, twisted and snarling, launched themselves from the back seat. He stepped sideways, dropped one with a boot to the face and buried his blade in the skull of the other before it could bite. The truck's glove box held a map of Prineville and an old emergency radio that might still work. "More ghosts of the road," Mike muttered, wiping his blade clean. Near sundown, they reached the outskirts of Prineville, where a gravel road snaked around the edge of the Ochoco Reservoir. The hike up was steep. They moved slow, wary of each shadow. Chris took point, machete ready. Tasha followed, rifle slung, eyes alert. Mike brought up the rear, and Ellis trudged alongside, breathing hard, his Forest Service jacket flapping with each step. They found an abandoned ranger outpost on a bluff overlooking the water. The doors were unlocked. Inside it was empty. No Devin, but there were supplies, cans stacked neatly, batteries, books, and best of all, a radio, still working, still warm. Chris keyed the mic. "Anyone out there?" Static. Then a click. "Oh, repeat, is anyone listening?" Tasha's eyes went wide. Mike leaned in. "That's real." Chris pressed the mic. "We hear you. Who is this?" Another burst of static. Then, "Name's Devin. If you found the outpost, you're close. I'm holed up in the caves north of the reservoir. I've got wounded. I need help." Chris looked at Mike, then at Tasha. "We're not done today," he said. They grabbed what they could, reloaded, and prepared to follow the voice into the dark. Chapter 6, Into the Caves. The fading sun cast long shadows over the reservoir as the group followed the narrow trail south. The landscape around them shifted from pine-lined banks to jagged basalt cliffs. The earth cracked and wind-sculpted, blackened by time. Somewhere in the ridges ahead, Devon waited, or so they hoped. The radio crackled occasionally, Devon's weak voice repeating the same phrase. "Still here. In the caves. Southmouth. Injured. Hurry." Chris took the lead again, machete sheathed for now, his pistol drawn. Mike flanked left with his rifle ready, scanning higher ground. Tasha followed close behind, bow in hand, while Ellis lagged but kept pace, a fire in his eyes despite the limp he'd developed. They'd made good time from the ranger station, but the terrain now grew harsh. Switchbacks carved through thorny underbrush. Fallen trees and loose rock turned the trail into a gauntlet. It was Ellis who spotted the first sign of trouble. A discarded medical bag, blood dried along its zipper. Gauze wrappers and empty saline bags scattered like confetti. "They passed through here," he said, crouching low. "And not long ago." Chris looked around. Eyes sharp. This could mean he's close, or someone else's. They descended into a ravine choked with brambles and rusted-out truck frames. Several vehicles had been pushed into the gorge, either abandoned or used as cover in a long-past standoff. Chris checked one for fuel and popped the door. A withered corpse snapped its jaw inside, still belted in. He plunged the blade through its skull, then siphoned 2 gallons of gas into a can they'd been carrying. Further down, Tasha opened the back of a minivan. 2 child zombies lunged, their bodies shriveled but fast. She let out a sharp cry, stumbling back. Mike's rifle barked twice. The silence that followed was deafening. Tasha stood over the bodies, breathing heavy. "It never gets easier." Mike nodded. "It shouldn't." The cave entrance appeared ahead, moss clinging to the rocks like veins. The air blowing out was damp, metallic, thick with decay. Tasha lit a flashlight. Chris and Mike went in first. The cave system was deeper than they expected. After 10 minutes of maneuvering through tight, craggy passages and guano-slick walls, they found signs of a scuffle drag marks, snapped glow sticks, a torn shirt. Devon was propped against a wall in a wider chamber, wrapped in a filthy blanket. His left leg was broken, a crude splint fashioned from hiking poles and duct tape. His eyes were bloodshot, but lucid. Around him, 3 others lay still. 2 had clearly succumbed to wounds, while the third, a woman, gasped quietly, feverish. "Devon," Chris breathed, crouching. "You're a damn mess." Devon smiled weakly. "You should see the other guy." "Who's she?" Tasha asked. "Rosa. She got bit. I kept the others away when she turned. I didn't want her to be alone." Ellis moved to check her pulse, but she jolted up, snarling, a fresh sprinter. Chris moved like lightning, driving his blade into her skull before she could reach Ellis. She dropped without a sound. Devon stared at the corpse, eyes moist. "I didn't have the strength." "You did what you could," Mike said. "Now we get you out of here." Before they could move, groaning echoed from deeper in the cave. The unmistakable sound of more shufflers. Mike clicked off his safety. "We've got company." They formed a tight perimeter. The zombies emerged from the dark 7, maybe 8 drawn by the light and the noise. The fight was savage. Chris's blade danced. Mike's rifle cracked. Tasha moved like a shadow, her arrows unerring. Ellis stabbed and slashed near Devon, who clutched a broken pistol like a talisman. One fell and crushed a glow stick under its body. The flickering green light painted their faces monstrous. Tasha screamed as one grabbed her shoulder, but Devon, dragging himself upright, drove a jagged bone into its throat. When the dust settled, the chamber was quiet but soaked in gore. "We can't stay," Chris said. "Devon, can you walk?" "Barely, but I know another way out. Follows a ridge above, steep but doable." They fashioned a stretcher from jackets and branches, lifting Devon between Chris and Ellis. The path wound up through jagged rock faces and loose scree. As they climbed, Chris asked, "Devon, what happened to the others?" Devon's face darkened. "Ambushed. We thought we were helping a family. They turned, bit Rosa. We lost Jake and Tanya trying to get out. I got clipped trying to lead the horde away. The rest didn't make it." Halfway up, disaster struck. Ellis lost his footing. The gravel shifted beneath his boots. He stumbled backward, gripping at nothing. Mike lunged, but too late. Ellis plummeted over the cliff edge. A sickening crunch echoed. They scrambled to the edge, hearts pounding. His body lay twisted far below, unmoving. "God damn it," Chris whispered. Tasha turned away, tears slipping down her cheeks. "We can't go down there," Mike said. We'll lose everyone. Chris stared a moment longer, jaw tight. Then he stood. We keep going. They reached the top by moonrise, breathless and numb. A ruined fire lookout stood silhouetted against the stars. They made camp in the broken shelter, Devon collapsing into sleep. They sat around a dim fire, nobody speaking. Tasha finally broke the silence. He didn't scream, not once. He knew, Mike said. We all do. Chris looked out across the valley. Tomorrow we bury him, and then we keep moving. Devon stirred. Ellis saved me. Don't let it be for nothing. Mike passed around the last energy drinks. They toasted without words. The silence was both reverent and suffocating. Above them, the stars blinked like ancient memories. Chapter 7, The Return of Sunglasses Guy. Preville waited like a hushed graveyard under the midday sun. The group Chris, Mike, Tasha, and Devon, bandaged and leaning heavily on a walking stick, moved slowly along the outskirts, scanning for danger. They hadn't seen a single soul since descending from the fire lookout, and that quiet felt louder than gunfire. They drove the last mile in silence, the truck rattling over broken pavement and strewn glass. Chris kept one hand on the wheel, the other near his pistol. Mike sat in the passenger seat, his rifle resting across his lap. Tasha and Devon rode in the back with their eyes constantly sweeping windows, rooftops, alleyways. They parked 2 blocks from the old Les Schwab Care Center. Beyond it sat a stretch of downtown that had been partially firebombed in the early weeks. Metal warped, storefronts melted, bones and shoes littered the sidewalks. But survivors had passed through signs of hasty barricades, graffiti warnings, and makeshift arrows spray-painted on brick walls. 2 days max, Chris muttered as they dismounted. We rest, resupply, then move. They scavenged with practiced precision. Day 1, they hit a pharmacy, half-picked clean, but Mike found antibiotics and bandages behind a collapsed display. Chris checked a sporting goods store and scored a box of 9mm round, some propane cans, and a nearly pristine machete. Mid-afternoon, they moved into residential blocks. They split up. Chris and Tasha cleared houses while Mike stayed with Devon, covering their base of operations in an old church rectory. A 2-story house on Main gave up a jackpot canned goods, medical wipes, and 4 sealed gallons of water. But the real find was in the garage. A reinforced Tacoma pickup with a mounted front winch, half a tank of gas, and the keys still dangling from the ignition. That night, they made a fire inside the church's old fireplace. They ate canned chili, passed around a single bottle of whiskey Mike had found, and took turns standing watch. Tasha asked about Chris and Mike's past before the fall military, law enforcement. Neither, Mike said with a half smile. We just grew up rough, learned early. Oh, what about you? Chris asked her. She paused. Vet tech, Seattle. Chris gave a solemn nod. The second day, the trouble found them. They were scouting a mechanics lot near the edge of town when a sound froze them in place. An engine. A growling, throaty V8 rumble echoing off the buildings. Chris swore. That's a Dodge, custom pipes. You hear it? Mike's eyes narrowed. Yeah, I know that sound. The truck appeared around the corner, murder black with metal plating bolted to the frame. Barbed wire wrapped the grille. Behind the wheel was a familiar face aviator shades, leather jacket, smug grin. Sunglasses guy, Mike said coldly. Son of a bitch. It was the thug who'd fled after Chris had taken out 3 of his crew at the gas station back near Terrebonne. They ducked into a nearby shop as the truck rolled slowly down the street. 2 more vehicles followed behind, one a beat-up Jeep with a roof-mounted gun, the other a flatbed filled with 5 men, all armed. We don't have the numbers, Chris muttered, but I'll be damned if I let that prick live again. Tasha pulled an arrow from her quiver. We could set a trap. Mike nodded. Church, bottleneck the entry. They moved fast. Devon took position in the bell tower with the rifle. Tasha and Mike set traps inside nails on boards, glass under rugs, a propane can ready to blow. Chris stood by the main doors with his machete and pistol. The bait was simple, noise. Tasha lit a fire in the street. Mike used a flashlight rigged to a string, flickering like someone trapped. The thugs came, 6 total, sunglasses guy in front. Told you I'd find you again, he shouted, stepping into the nave. Chris grinned. I was hoping you would. Mike dropped one of the men with 3 clean shots to the chest. But the gunfire had drawn the attention of the second vehicle, the Jeep with the mounted machine gun. A sudden burst of fire ripped through the church wall. Devon, scrambling from the bell tower to reposition, was caught mid-step. The rounds shredded the staircase. A sharp, horrible sound followed his body tumbling to the floor below. Devon! Tasha screamed, running to him, but Chris was already there, checking for a pulse. Nothing. Devon's lifeless eyes stared up at the crumbling ceiling. "No time," Mike barked. "They're circling back." They scrambled into cover as the machine gun cut another pass across the nave. Wood splintered, stone cracked. Chris peeked through the shattered window, timed it, and fired his pistol. Precision shots ended each man's life. They never knew what hit them. Tasha fired arrows through broken stained glass. One thug dropped. The other dove behind the flatbed. Mike flanked through the side door, silenced pistol popping. Clean. Controlled. Within minutes, chaos reigned. The church was burning, and the enemy was broken. Sunglasses guy stumbled through smoke, blood pouring from his arm. He saw his men dying and made a break for his truck. Chris chased. They met in the street, both worn, both bleeding. Sunglasses guy pulled a blade. Chris didn't hesitate. They clashed, metal ringing off metal. Chris sidestepped a wild slash, buried his machete in the thug's thigh. The man roared, tackled Chris into a wrecked sedan. Glass shattered, elbows, knees, blood. Chris rolled, twisted the machete free and stabbed it upward, driving it through the bastard's ribs. "You should have stayed gone," Chris growled. The man choked, gasped, and fell. Chris stood panting. They gathered what they could: ammo, food, gasoline, a working CB radio. That night they rested in silence. Chris stood at the front doors, Devon's rifle across his back. "That bastard was a shadow I needed to kill," he murmured. Below, the others mourned in their own way. Tomorrow they'd move east, toward the Ochakos, toward whatever waited next. Chapter 8, Into the Pines of Sun River. The road south bent like a scar through central Oregon's high desert, then dropped them into the dense forest and manicured wilderness of Sun River. Once a resort paradise tucked beneath snow-draped peaks, it now sat cloaked in rot and silence. The pine air still smelled clean, but it was a lie, the kind that whispered from empty lodges and hollow vacation homes. Chris drove. Mike rode shotgun, sorting ammo. In the back seat, Tasha was quiet, her eyes unreadable. The loss of Devon lingered like smoke. None of them had really spoken since Prinville, just shared looks and checked weapons. Now as they approached the outskirts of the resort, the silence grew heavier. "This place had everything once," Mike muttered, finally breaking the quiet. "Shops, restaurants, a lazy damn river. Let's see what's left," Chris said. The entrance sign still stood Sun River Resort. Someone had painted a red X across it, and beneath, in black, "Dead inside. Stay out." They ignored it. They rolled straight in, truck tires crunching over pine needles and broken asphalt. Chris parked near the Sun River Lodge entrance, engine idling low. Without hesitation, they dismounted. Chris took point with his machete, Mike flanking with his rifle, and Tasha behind, bow ready. Their first stop was the lodge. The once grand building loomed like a haunted relic. Several zombies wandered just beyond the entryway, former guests or staff, still dressed in golf polos and housekeeper uniforms, now slack-jawed and reeking. Chris and Mike moved like clockwork. Mike picked off the far ones with 2 quick shots while Chris stepped in, machete carving arcs of finality. One of the undead lunged at Tasha, but she sidestepped and drove an arrow through its eye. Within minutes, the lobby was still. They moved through each floor, clearing the building room by room. Once secured, Chris found a maintenance closet and began reinforcing the main doors. Mike hauled furniture to barricade the windows. Tasha located the kitchen, scouted for supplies, and started inventory. This would be their base, the hub from which they'd scavenge and store supplies over the next 2 days. From there, they swept into the village at Sun River. Hot Lava Bakery was first. The windows were blown out, jagged shards of glass still clinging to the frame. A faint breeze stirred flour-dusted air, carrying the musty stench of mildew, burnt pastry, and old blood. Birds had nested in the rafters, cooing softly as beams of sunlight filtered through the broken ceiling, casting long shadows across the counters. The crew moved cautiously, boots crunching on shattered ceramic. Behind the half-melted display case, Chris opened a cooler to find 3 bottles of water still sealed. In the back, a zombie cook lurched out from behind a flour-caked prep tableskin green-gray, apron rotted. Tasha didn't flinch. One arrow silent and straight through the eye. Sun River Brewing Co. came next. The heavy scent of stale beer lingered like a ghost, mixing with the sharp tang of decay. Sunlight poured through cracked skylights, catching dust motes in midair. Pint glasses lay shattered across the bar floor, some still filled with dried sludge. They stepped around overturned bar stools and broken bar taps. Blood smeared the far wall, the room a tableau of chaos. From behind the bar, two shamblers emerged, drawn by the motion. Chris and Mike moved as 1-2 muffled gunshots echoed and the bodies collapsed. At Marcello's Cucina Italiana, the front door had been boarded hastily. They circled to the back, where the kitchen door hung ajar, hinges rusted. The smell hit them immediately, rancid grease, mold, and something worse. The kitchen was a crypt. Pots still sat on burners, blackened with time. In the dish pit, a bloated zombie chef writhed, trapped under a rack. Mike hesitated, watching it twitch, then shot it between the eyes. Its final breath escaped like steam from a broken valve. Blondie's pizza was better. The scent of stale marinara and aged dough hung in the air, but no undead waited inside. A pair of raccoons scattered from a tipped trash bin near the register. Shelves were ransacked, but in the manager's office, they found matches, a few canned sodas, and a box of unopened jerky behind a drawer. At Cafe Sintra, shadows ruled. The interior was dim, windows dusted over, the only light coming from shafts of sun breaking through torn blinds. Every footstep echoed. Booths sat abandoned, with plates still on the tables, some half covered in mold. As they crept forward, flashlights danced over a slumped woman in one booth. Chris edged closer, heart pounding, nudged the table with his machete. She stirred a gurgling moan, face lifting to reveal a single eye, tongue mangled to pulp. Chris didn't hesitate. One clean slice. They gathered supplies and stored everything back at the lodge. Monster drinks, jerky, medical gauze, duct tape, batteries, everything accounted for, everything labeled. Later that day, they moved toward the marina and outfitter shops. The village bar and grill was a scorched skeleton burned out, black soot smearing the shattered windows. They pressed on. A small hunting store nearby still stood. Inside, they kept low. Shelves were mostly bare, but Chris found a bin of arrows, still shrink-wrapped. Mike pulled a belt of .308 rounds from a rusted display case. Tasha located a solar charger and a hunting knife. Circle K was a tense sweep. The front glass was spidered but intact. Inside, they stepped through broken snacks and long warm drink coolers. In the back corner, a corpse in a hoodie was slumped across the ice chest. Mike edged forward. It didn't move. Dead. They found 2 fuel canisters, a box of batteries, and a working handheld radio. South Bend Bistro was the final stop. Inside, light broke through the angled windows, casting stained glass shadows across the wine rack. Glass crunched beneath their boots. One of the undead crawled from behind the bar, dragging ruined legs, mouth open in a silent hiss. Tasha didn't break stride. She stepped forward, drove a knife down with surgical force. The zombie twitched once and was still. Night came fast. At the lodge, they shared what they'd found. Chris built a fire in the stone hearth. The soft crackle filled the cavernous room, flickering against polished logs and faded resort banners. "That's day 1, Mike said, sipping Monster. "Not bad." Chris looked toward the second-story railing. "Tomorrow we check the marina and surrounding cabins. Then we head home." Tasha nodded. "We've done enough damage for one day." They sat together under the antler chandelier, silent and warm. And above them, the forest pressed in. Chapter 9, Echoes of Sun River. They awoke just before dawn. The sky outside the lodge stained a soft violet. Pine branches etched like black lace against the horizon. Chris was already up, pacing. Mike rubbed the sleep from his eyes and loaded fresh rounds into his rifle. Tasha stood by the door, a monster drink in one hand, her breath fogging the glass pane. Today was their last full day in Sun River. "Let's sweep the neighborhood," Chris said. "One house at a time. Be quick, be quiet." They rolled out in the truck, the tires crunching over broken pine cones and patches of frost. Their route began on Beaver Drive, the backbone of Sun River's residential layout, weaving past homes that once hosted summer laughter, now silent beneath layers of moss and creeping ivy. The architecture was rustic vaulted beams, stone chimneys, wraparound decks, but the air was heavy. Still, tainted. Their first stop was a 2-story lodge-style home at the corner of Beaver Drive and Woodland Lane. The front door hung askew, hinge rusted through. Inside, the living room was frozen in Time magazines on the coffee table. A dusty chess game mid-play, a dried bouquet crumbling in a vase. But the smell told the truth. They found a couple probably vacationers collapsed near the upstairs bathroom. No signs of infection.
Just
Time. Chris pulled the comforter over their forms. The garage yielded better news. 2 propane tanks, a half-filled gas can, and a pair of bikes with usable tires. Mike found a tool kit and tossed it into the truck. Tasha grabbed spare flashlights and a working AM/FM radio. Across the street, they hit Pine Mountain Lane. It was quieter here. The homes spaced farther apart, swallowed by trees. One driveway held a Toyota Tacoma with a cracked windshield. Chris popped the gas cap and siphoned a half-gallon. Inside the truck, old fishing gear, some tackle, a few cans of baked beans, and a folded map of the Deschutes National Forest. A few blocks down, on Big Leaf Lane, they encountered their first resistance of the morning. A black Escalade was parked crooked in the drive, doors open. As Mike approached, a low hiss echoed from inside. Two zombies, child-size, seat-belted in the back, snapped awake. Their faces were sun-rotted, blackened and blistered, maggots crawling in open sockets. Mike didn't hesitate. Two suppressed shots, then silence. He exhaled hard. "That'll haunt me," he muttered. "They're gone now," Chris said, voice flat. They moved faster after that. Time felt tight. At a small home on White Elm Road, Tasha found a pantry still half-stocked cans of vegetables, powdered milk, even some vacuum-sealed jerky. A dead family of 4 was in the master bedroom, arranged as if sleeping. No blood, no bite marks, just surrender. Chris stood for a long moment at the doorway, then shut it quietly behind him. Later that afternoon, they stumbled on something strange. On Summit View Lane, a large backyard pool glimmered in the sun. The water was foul green and opaque, algae thick on the surface. But in the deep end, they saw them. A dozen zombies, trapped. Some swam in slow circles. Others simply stood submerged to the neck, their heads snapping, following the crew's movement. "What the hell?" Tasha whispered. One lunged and slipped beneath the water, bubbles streaming from its mouth. "They can't get out," Mike said. "The pool's too deep, too slick." "Still hungry, though," Chris muttered. He considered for a moment, then said nothing more. They moved on. On Comas Lane, they found a small A-frame cabin, meticulously clean. A stack of children's books still sat on the nightstand, and a dollhouse had been set carefully on a table. But in the garage was something grim, a makeshift bed, chains bolted to the floor. No bodies, just bloodstains. No one spoke. On Red Cedar Lane, they encountered a home with solar panels still intact. Inside, the lights flickered dimly, the battery backup still functioning. The fridge hummed weakly. In it, a few bottles of water remained cold. A zombie stood in the living room, face pressed to the window, groaning. Mike approached from behind and ended it with a silent blade. On Fox Lane, they found evidence of a last stand. Furniture barricaded the front windows. Inside, bullet holes riddled the walls. Empty casings scattered like confetti. A calendar on the fridge had red X's through each day. The final day was marked, "We tried, goodbye." All 3 stood silent as they searched. A box of medical supplies was stashed in the closet, still usable. On Abbott Drive, a zombie woman stood motionless at the foot of a bed. She was holding the desiccated hand of a man, long dead and skeletal. As the crew entered, she turned slowly. Tasha stepped forward and ended her without a word. Chris found canned goods in the kitchen, untouched. The house on Blue Grouse Lane. It was a luxurious rental property. Big screen TV, wine fridge, granite countertops. But rot was everywhere. The scent was overwhelming. A generator in the garage had run dry long ago. In one of the bathrooms, a teen had barricaded himself in and taken his life. The note he'd left behind was brief. "Didn't want to turn. Sorry, Mom." By evening, the truck bed was full. 2 more gas cans. Tools. A cooler with melted ice but salvageable MREs. More monster drinks. Tasha found a set of field bandages at a garage sale shelf on Tanager Lane. They made one last stop at a cul-de-sac on Jack Pine Lane, where a storage shed held a stack of unused propane tanks. 8101 Cottonwood Road. They found a home built like a fortress, steel shutters, reinforced doors, and a rooftop deck. Inside, journals revealed a former prepper who had lasted nearly a year. He died of a leg wound, unable to move. His skeleton remained in the bathroom, the mirror cracked above him. They gathered his stored supplies, freeze-dried meals, vitamins, and ammunition. On Antelope Lane, a modern home had been completely overtaken by the forest of crawling through broken windows, pine needles carpeting the floor. A zombie sat in an armchair facing a long-dead TV, gnawing endlessly on a throw pillow. Tasha ended it with a sigh. In the basement, they discovered an off-grid power unit and a hidden cache of liquor. Meadowlark Lane offered one of the eeriest stops. A 2-story house had every room covered in spray-painted warnings. "Stay out. We're infected. And too late. They moved cautiously through each level, weapons drawn. No bodies. But the stench of rot lingered. Upstairs in a locked bedroom, they found a dog alive, trembling, emaciated. Tasha fed it jerky and carried it out. A brick home on East Butte Road had been the site of a fire. Charred beams still held the shape of a roof. Beneath a collapsed wall, they found remains. Judging by the scattered photo albums and toys, it had been a family. Chris muttered something under his breath, barely audible. They scavenged what little they could. A metal toolbox and some fireproofed canned peaches. The last addition came from a quiet cul-de-sac on Timber Lane. A pristine house, windows intact, grass still trimmed, too perfect. They approached with unease. Inside it was eerily silent. They searched room by room until they reached the nursery. There, a crib held a zombie toddler. Its milky eyes blinked slowly, fingers twitching. Chris stepped forward. One motion. Mercy. He didn't speak for the next hour. They returned to the lodge just before dark. The forest was whispering again. The sky was bleeding red. Inside, they unpacked in silence. Chris lit a fire. Tasha finally spoke. You think we'll ever stop seeing this kind of shit? Mike cracked open a drink, gave half of it to the dog they found. No, we just get better at carrying it. Chris stared into the flames. Tomorrow we head home. The fire cracked. Outside an owl called once, then went silent. Day 2 in Sun River had ended. The ghosts would stay, but they would move on. Chapter 10. The Road Back. The morning air was crisp, sharper than the day before, and carried the scent of pine and damp earth through the open windows of the lodge. A rare stillness lingered, not ominous but peaceful. Chris stood on the deck, sipping from a lukewarm Monster energy drink, eyes fixed on the pale golden sunrise bleeding over the tree line. Birds called in the distance, a surprise after so many silent dawns. Behind him, the lodge creaked with waking life. Mike loaded the last of the propane and MREs into the bed of the truck. Tasha moved quietly through the lodge, checking packs, gathering the last of the gear. They had one final talk that morning, standing beside the truck as the engine idled low. The air smelled like dust and cedar. We could stay, Mike said. Plenty of space, more supplies than we've ever found. We could reinforce it. Ride out the winter. Chris shook his head slowly, eyes distant. It's not home, not really. Tasha leaned against the bumper. Seems safer than the cabin, though. Safe doesn't mean permanent, Chris replied. We know the terrain up north. We've lasted this long because we know how to move in that forest. Mike gave a tired sigh and tapped the side of the truck. All right then, let's roll. They drove south through Sun River, the truck rolling slow past the marina and village. The buildings stood quiet, their windows like blank eyes. They passed the South Bend Bistro, now a burned-out husk. Past the outfitter shops, looted and hollow. The forest whispered around them. Once on Highway 97 heading north, the world stretched wide again. Rolling desert plains opened on either side, the landscape dotted with skeletal trees and the occasional blackened barn. Distant figures moved across the field, zombies, solitary or in slow-moving clusters. None chased the truck. They only turned, following the sound like flowers toward light. Cattle wandered the sagebrush, ribs showing, heads low. Some were dead, some were not. Chris drove. Tasha sat in the back seat with the dog asleep on her lap. Mike watched the rear view. It's strange, Tasha said softly. I thought leaving Seattle would be the worst part. It wasn't. Neither brother responded. She continued, voice a whisper against the wind. We made it to Portland just before the highways closed. My brother and I, we thought Ben would be safer. He'd gone to college there, knew people. But everything fell apart when we stopped at that gas station. Silence, only the road hummed beneath them. I wandered for weeks, she said. Joined a group in Sisters. That didn't last long. Bad people. Took what they wanted. I left. Was on my own when you found me. Chris nodded slowly. You're not on your own anymore. The road climbed into the Ochocos. Pines thickened, snow dusted the shadows. The truck crawled past wrecks long burned, over bridges where vines had begun to take root. They made one stop outside Prinville, an old gas station. Half the pumps were destroyed. Chris checked the back, while Mike siphoned from a wrecked camper. Tasha stayed near the truck, dog at her feet, rifle across her knees. Inside the station, they found little. A half-eaten rat, molded bread. But under the counter, a stash of old topo maps. Chris grinned. Looks like we'll be taking a new route home. Less highway, more cover. Back in the truck, the mood had shifted slightly. Lighter. Not quite hopeful, but steady. By late afternoon, they crested the ridge above the valley that held their cabin. The familiar tree line made the brothers smile. Home. Chris parked 100 yards from the cabin. They approached on foot, rifles ready. No tracks, no noise. Just the familiar scent of pine and the creak of old wood as they opened the door. The place was exactly as they left it. Chris checked the traps. Mike confirmed the perimeter. Tasha set her pack down and finally let herself exhale. After securing the area, they got the truck and parked behind the cabin. Inside, as the fire crackled and night rolled in, they all sat together, including the dog, for the first time in days with no immediate fear pressing in. They were alive. They were home. And the world, for one fragile moment, felt still again.